So I want to say hello to people all over the world who've tuned into the first of a series of conversations that matter with people with real experience, insight, and wisdom on the issues of global security and our very future. And it's really an honor to do the first one with Ambassador Thomas Graham. It is fair to say that there is no one in the world who has negotiated more treaties dealing with nuclear non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament than Ambassador Graham. And we'll talk about that in this dialogue. So, Ambassador Graham, I'm sort of going backwards here because, as you know, this year is the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And you and I, we've devoted our lives to making sure this doesn't happen again. And we'll go back over your career. But I want to start out so that we have a framework of why we're doing this. What is the reality of it? And the last time an atomic bomb was dropped was on Nagasaki. And you and I are in a working group in an interfaith initiative, the United Religions Initiative, with former Secretary of Defense William Perry, Ambassador James Goodby, Bishop Bill Swing, religious leaders all over the world, former Secretary of State George Shultz. And as you know, we're doing an event to commemorate and to highlight Hiroshima and Nagasaki very soon. And you talked at our last meeting about a lot of details of Nagasaki that none of us were aware of. And I wondered if you could just educate us a little bit about the last time a nuclear bomb was dropped on human beings.
Well, Jonathan, I'd be happy to do that. But I want to stress at the very beginning that this is a long story, and I'm going to compress it into 5 minutes. And I won't really be able to do it justice, but I'll do the best I can. It's a historic city. It was the only open city during the 250 years Japan was closed off from the world. And it was the only place that Christians were allowed to live after they were wiped out in the early 1600s in Japan. Leslie Groves, the military commandant of the Los Alamos project, said years later he never did understood how Nagasaki got into the picture at all. And it was not on the original list of 17 cities that were being reserved for atomic attack. And 6 or 7 of those cities were not bombed by the Air Force to preserve them as, you might say, laboratories for the bomb. But a number of them were, and so when they began to narrow the list, some were thrown out because they had been bombed. And Kyoto was deleted from the list twice by Secretary of War Stimson on cultural and religious grounds. So they were down to, by the time they got to Nagasaki after the Hiroshima attack, they only had a few cities. And at the very last minute, the last day, somebody just wrote Nagasaki in pen, with a pen on the order. And that's how they got on the list. And then somehow they ended up as the backup site for the Nagasaki, for the second bombing. The second bombing was supposed to attack Kokura arsenal near Yokohama, and 2 B-29s went there, one with the bomb and one with electronic devices in it. And when they got to Kokura, it was covered with haze and smoke. Most of the smoke was from a firebombing the U.S. had done the day before in the next door city. And so there was a rule that for those 2 attacks that the bombardier is supposed to be able to see the target because they wanted to be precise as they could with the bomb, and they couldn't see anything in Kokura. So the pilot of the B-29 with the bomb turned south towards towards Nagasaki. And he had realized while in flight that his second tank was not working. So he had very little fuel. He just had the first tank worth of fuel. And so it was going to be a close run thing whether he'd be able to get to Nagasaki, bomb Nagasaki, and still find a place to land somewhere in the Pacific, probably Okinawa, rather than the place they left from, which was Tinian. And anyway, they got to Nagasaki, and it was fogged in too. Not fogged in, but it was heavy clouds. And they couldn't see anything. And so then suddenly, after a little bit of circling, the bombardier shouts, "I got it, I got it." So it was turned over to him. Now, no one really knows what it was the bombardier saw. Either there was a hole in the clouds and he saw some railroad tracks, or he saw nothing at all, and did the bombing by radar. But in any case, they just decided that they couldn't wait any longer. They had to let the bomb go or drop it in the ocean, and it was worth $2 billion, and they weren't about to do that. And if they didn't act right away, they wouldn't be able to bomb anything. So the bombardier shouted, "I got it, I got it." Pilot turned over the bomb to him, and he dropped it on who knows what. And they didn't know what they'd bombed. It turned out they did destroy the only military thing in the city, which was the torpedo factory. But they also destroyed the historic Christian cathedral, the only one in Japan, the largest one in Asia, along with priests and Catholic school children and so forth. And so ironically, the one site in Japan of you might say Western culture, vaguely, since it was a Catholic cathedral, was what was struck unintentionally by the bomber. And after releasing the bomb, they flew to Okinawa, which was closer, landed there, and just as they landed, the engine stopped running for lack of gas. And so it was just, the whole thing was chancy, uncertain, they never intended to be there. They never intended to drop the bomb where they did. And it just points out that these weapons, in addition to being enormously dangerous, are subject to mistake and error, just like any other bombing. But the effects are just so much more catastrophic that they're not the kind of thing you want to allow mistakes with. So that's, in brief, the story of Nagasaki.
When you tell it and how many aspects were unexpected, arbitrary, coincidental, it reminds me of the 19-year-old Serbian assassin in Sarajevo, right, who went to assassinate the prince, and he gave up, and he was going home, and he stopped to have a cigarette by a delicatessen, literally, and there was a traffic jam, and then the motorcade had to change its route, and the victim ended up just in front of him. He pulled his gun and shot him, and within weeks, the whole world was at war. And just the fact that with nuclear bombs, there's so little room for error. And I think that just giving a sense of the texture that there were human beings making mistakes and making decisions on the fly. But I want to read a little bit about the testimony of the mayor of Nagasaki when he testified before the International Court of Justice, which addressed the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons in 1995. Of course, most of the world didn't follow that trial, a very important trial in which the court unanimously ruled that there's a duty to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons, because there was another trial going on then, as you'll recall. It was the O.J. Simpson trial. And this is, this is what the mayor of Nagasaki reminds us of. The explosion of the atomic bomb generated an enormous fireball 200 meters in radius, almost as though a small sun had appeared in the sky. The next instant, a ferocious blast and wave of heat assailed the ground with a thunderous roar. The surface temperature of the fireball was about 7,000 degrees centigrade, and the heat rays that reached the ground were over 3,000 degrees centigrade. The explosion instantly killed or injured people within a 2-kilometer radius of the hypocenter, leaving innumerable corpses charred like clumps of charcoal and scattered in the ruins near the hypocenter. In some cases, not even a trace of the person's remains could be found. A wind over 680 miles per hour slapped down trees and demolished most of the buildings. Even iron-reinforced concrete structures were so badly damaged that they seemed to have been smashed by a giant hammer. The fierce flash of heat, meanwhile, melted glass and left metal objects contorted like strands of taffy. And the subsequent fires burned the ruins of the burned the ruins of the city to ashes. Nagasaki became a city of death, where not even the sound of insects could be heard. After a while,
I'd like to add just a couple more brief things. I have been to Nagasaki. I've been to the cathedral, and they told me there that when the bomb struck, the priest just about to begin a sacrament. There were about 32 parishioners, 35 parishioners, and 2 priests, and it was 11 in the morning, and they were just about to begin the sacrament of penitence and reconciliation when the bomb struck, and it not only destroyed the cathedral, but thousands of school children who were in schools related to the cathedral were also killed. And second, just briefly, I met with one of the survivors of Nagasaki while I was there, and he actually worked at the torpedo factory, and he said that he was the only person to survive the attack, and it was just it was an ordinary morning, and suddenly he found himself in a tree a mile away, and he survived. Nobody else did, and he was still alive in his 70s. But it's also unpredictable and chancy, and it just shouldn't. Oh, and one last thing. In the long run, if our efforts bear fruit, in the long run, the Nagasaki attack will be more important than the Hiroshima attack. The Hiroshima attack involved the first time that nuclear weapons were used in anger. The Nagasaki attack, hopefully, and was last time.
the testimony emphasizes the reality on the ground now. And the mayor said, after a while, countless men, women, and children began to gather for a drink of water at the banks of the nearby Urakami River, their hair and clothing scorched and their burnt skin hanging off in sheets like rags. Begging for help, they died one after another in the water or in heaps on the banks. Then radiation began to take its toll, killing people like a scourge of death, expanding in concentric circles from the hypocenter. 4 months after the atomic bombing, 74,000 people were dead and 75,000 had suffered injuries. That is 2/3 of the city population had fallen victim to this calamity that came upon Nagasaki, like a preview of the apocalypse. And now, Tom, you've done so much. You've been in the room when the web of human relations between states has been created to constrain the spread of these horrible devices and move toward a nuclear weapons-free world. When did you first begin getting involved in working for the United States government and the arms control area?
Well, I went to college, studied in France, graduated from law school, held a series of jobs for about 9 years. But I always wanted to get into something involving international matters. And I had a job in the Defense Department's General Counsel, Air Force General Counsel office after the '68 election, negotiating radar installations in the north of Canada. And I heard about this small agency that was associated with the State Department called the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. And its mission was to negotiate disarmament treaties with the Soviet Union as well as other countries. And I thought that, well, that'd be an interesting place to work. And I also was told that they were looking for a lawyer who had had experience working on the Hill. And at that point, I'd had both. I spent a year on the Hill, and I was a lawyer and had practiced. So I went over there and applied for a job. And the general counsel looked over my resume and talked with me, and he said, well, you fit our requirements. One of our lawyers does our congressional relations. We're such a small office. This is such a small agency. That's why we need both skills. You seem to have them, but I have to warn you that this is a political organization in a highly political administration, that is Nixon. And so you have to show political support before you can have this job. Well, it just happened by chance, purest chance, that the two Kentucky senators, I'm from Kentucky, were two of my father's best friends. And one of them, Thurston Morton, was the Republican national chairman. And the other one, John Sherman Cooper, was ranking Republican on foreign relations. They both wrote letters for me. I got the job. The rest is history, except I was happy to have the job. I thought it would be very interesting. And it wasn't until about 10 years later, I finally understood that this is the job I always should have.
People don't know much about treaties and how they work and what they do. And I can tell you, most millennials have no idea that we used to have an agency in the United States government that was created during the administration of Kennedy after the Cuban Missile Crisis that had a mandate to negotiate disarmament. And the very first resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations, which the United States vigorously supported, called for the elimination of all weapons of mass destruction, specifically naming these horrible weapons. So this has been a call, really a bipartisan call. Even the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty came into force with Richard Nixon. This has been a call that has been a dynamic within our government that has been bipartisan. While even during the military buildups, a lot of law constrained proliferation to other countries, but it didn't constrain the Soviet Union and the United States. I'd like you to tell us just generally the most important nodes on the web of treaties that have been created to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, and where appropriate, where we have pledges to actually obtain the elimination of nuclear weapons, the legally binding pledge of the United States to obtain elimination.
Well, the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, I'll just call it ACTA from now on, which is what everyone called it, was always an intensely controversial agency. Everything we did was controversial. And I think the conservatives initially supported it, as one of them said, because we'll get all the weirdos in one place and we can watch them better. But in any case, we were always, on the defensive to some extent. They lead the negotiation to provide, pursuant to the treaty, which expired after its first 25 years, but it gave a one-time option for renewal to make it permanent. And when we began, nobody thought that, I was in charge of that, and I had determined that no matter what, I was going to stay with permanent extension, because I thought in the very end there'd be enough votes. The decision was to be my majority vote, that somehow I would find a majority. But everybody else thought I was going to concede, give the third world rolling over.
Tom, I want to stop here and give our listeners a little context of this moment in history in 1995, when you led the United States delegation in a matter that I think was of the gravest importance. I view the treaty that you're talking about, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that entered into force in 1970 when Nixon was president, as the third most important legal instrument of the 20th century. The UN Charter being the first, a place where all the nations of the world can talk. The second being the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that states that there's values and principles that transcend even nations. And the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as you know, came into effect after the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the KGB and the CIA both concluded that absent some legal constraint, there'd be dozens of nuclear weapon states. So it's been an extremely successful treaty. And it had within it the provision in 1970 that after 25 years, the parties would come back together and determine whether the treaty would be indefinitely extended for another period of time, 25 years or whatever they agreed upon, or terminated. And it was on your shoulders to push to have this treaty, which contains within it, well, what was the core bargain of the treaty? Why is the treaty important? What does the treaty tell the world of the commitments of the countries with nuclear weapons and the countries without nuclear weapons?
Let me first say that it was a very close run thing to accomplish, and the treaty provides that nuclear weapons should not spread beyond the original ones that had the bomb. That's all that could be accomplished at that time. And it flowed also from President Kennedy's famous statement that what worries him the most is that by 1975, there'll be 10 nuclear weapon states rather than 4. And by 1980, there will be 20 to 25 nuclear weapon states in the world. And I would regard that, he said, as the greatest possible danger and threat. And so, and many people felt that, but the so-called third world didn't trust the first world, that is the nuclear weapon states, to ever disarm. And I think history has, to some extent, justified that suspicion. But so they wanted to keep it fuzzy. They wanted to keep their feet at the fire, but this option that was provided in 1995 was a one-time deal, because it could be done by the parties themselves voting in a conference. After that, you have to go to legislatures, which would be impossible. So it was then or never. And what it did stop nuclear weapons from spreading very much. There's still only 9 nuclear weapon states in the world instead of 25, like President Kennedy feared, and maybe 45, like would be possible now. But it wasn't a gift from the non-nuclear weapon states. It was a strategic bargain, and in exchange for when the treaty was made permanent, making their obligations permanent, in exchange for agreeing to never have nuclear weapons, never have the most powerful weapons in the world, never have the weapon that make a country a great power, because that's how great powers were determined during the Cold War, who had the weapons and who didn't. And to some extent that's still true, but it was definitely true in the Cold War, during the Cold War. And in exchange for that, the nuclear weapon states were to share peaceful technology with everyone, and everyone share it back. And secondly, negotiate the end of the arms race and ultimately the elimination of their stockpiles. And the fundamental indicia of whether they were carrying out their objectives, as stated in 1968 and as stated in 1995, was a commitment never to test again, a legally binding treaty never to carry out another nuclear weapon test. The position of the non-nuclear weapon states was, well, we understand that it's difficult to eliminate weapons in the Cold War and the situation that we have, but at least the nuclear weapon states can stop testing. And to this day, we still don't have such a treaty. But we did negotiate a comprehensive test ban treaty. I led the efforts in the US government to establish the moratorium, which is the only thing that we have controlling nuclear weapons worldwide now. But President Clinton was the first to announce it as a result of our work in within the government. The treaty was signed by 165 parties at the United Nations, and we now have about 160 parties, 170 parties, including Germany, Japan, Russia, France, and Great Britain. And under the terms of the treaty, all countries that had any nuclear facilities in 1996, the year it was signed, must ratify it to bring it into force. There's only 8 of those that have not ratified, and if the US were to ratify, I am personally very confident the other 7 would as well. Nobody else is testing, but it's been blocked since 1999 by the Republican Party in the United States Senate.
So take us back to 1995 when you're leading the US delegation. The promises made in the treaty that in 1970, when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty enters into force, that there will be negotiations in good faith to eliminate the weapons. The Cold War buildups take place. We're up to over 65,000 of them when Gorbachev and Reagan meet in Geneva in 1985, I think it was.
85, yeah.
And they said, they agreed, a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. And then they start committing to lowering the number of weapons, and things really change from that point. I say parenthetically, I know that that all of our allies in NATO and Russia as well want to reconfirm that pledge, that maxim, that knowledge that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. But the current administration of our country is neglecting to give us that assurance. But I want to go back to that moment in '95 when the core bargain is really at risk, because the non-aligned countries, the third world, whatever you want to call it, the majority of countries in the world come to the negotiations, and they say, we haven't seen good faith negotiations on elimination. Why should we trust you to indefinitely extend this? It looks like you've conned us. You conned us into giving up this powerful indicia of prestige and power. We have scientists. We can produce fissile material, and we promised not to do it. We've lived up to our part of the bargain. Malaysia, Indonesia, middle power countries, Canada, Japan, all of these countries, all of the Nordic countries, the countries in Europe could have produced the weapons, and certainly more countries today have the technological capacity. And in 95, many did. And they said, why should we do this? What will you give us in return? What will you give us in return for a commitment that we'll never have nuclear weapons? That's what they put before you. What did you commit that we would give them? And then what did we commit in 2000 in furtherance of that commitment? What did you commit on behalf of our country, Tom?
Well, I can tell you that. This process, by the way, was established by South Africa, who played a key role in 1995 in trying to bring first world and third world together. Whereas this is not legally binding the way extension is legally binding, it's politically binding, and it's the political price for the extension. And it's a statement of principles and objectives for disarmament and a strengthening of the review process. And commitment number one was to have a comprehensive test ban treaty in 1 year. And then there was commitment for much further reductions. There was a commitment for nuclear weapon free zones, especially in the Middle East. There was a commitment for a treaty limiting fissile material. There was a commitment for stronger verification, which led to the additional protocol in the IAEA, and perhaps one or two others. But the CTBT was number one.
Tom, let's just stop here. The additional protocol of the IAEA means greater inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency of countries that have said they've restrained themselves from having nuclear weapons, and it's the inspection regime that safeguards it. So it was a very practical safeguarding effort that we promised to strengthen.
Right, that's correct.
So I'm sorry, I interrupted because I know there's people who are not as deep in this.
That's what we agreed to. And we have not delivered, well, principally because of the United States on the test ban, we have not delivered on that. And it's well, I mean, you can call it what you want, but they gave us a legally binding commitment for the treaty to be permanent, and we gave them a politically binding commitment to have a test ban plus these other things. And we've achieved a few of the other things, but not the test ban, which is the most important.
Well, I also think that there's the International Court of Justice interpreting the legal duties of the nuclear weapon states, inconsistent with that pledge of negotiating disarmament, have stated that there's a duty of the states with nuclear weapons to commence and complete negotiations on elimination. So I think that there is argument that it's not just a political commitment, but it's a legal obligation that sits out there not being adhered to. Would you agree with that?
There's one other point I should mention. At the insistence of, I had a very difficult time with the Egyptians who wanted to see action by the Israelis with respect to their nuclear arsenal. And I spent a lot of time with Foreign Minister Musa. I made 7 trips to Cairo to talk to him about this. He said, you know, why should I care about the NPT? I've got all these weapons right next door. What guarantee can you give me that some nut won't take over sometime and use them against everybody in the Middle East? And wait a minute, let me finish. So this caused a long negotiation, which ended up in the UN basement the night before the vote. And finally, we agreed to a resolution in that meeting in the basement of the UN. And but I said it's got to be. I mean, everyone understood that nobody would sponsor this, except Donna Paula asked if the depositaries, the 3 depositary states for the Non-Proliferation Treaty going back to the Cold War practice of Britain, the United States, and Russia now, would they introduce it. And I said, well, speaking for the US, yes, we will. But the rest of them are at a very nice dinner party where I would be if I wasn't here. And so I know where I can get them. So I'll call them. So I went to the corner of the room and where there was a phone. I called the restaurant and asked for the room, got the British ambassador, and he said, yes, I think we can co-sponsor. And I got the Russian ambassador, and he said, well, I think we can, Tom, but I have to check with Moscow. Remember, nothing was written down. This was just a verbal exchange at this point. And so with that, we ended the meeting in hopes that all would be well in the morning. And I guess somebody typed up this agreement that we had spoken about and to be introduced on the floor the next day, along with the indefinite extension and the commitment to pursue disarmament and disarmament principles. And so I'm having breakfast in my hotel room, and I get a call from the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, a close friend of mine for many years. And he said, Tom, he said, Moscow says I can co-sponsor. I said, oh, that's great, Sergei. He said, but there's a condition. Oh, well, there is? What's the condition? They say I have to read it first. And so he did get a chance to read it, and see, nobody had read it at that point. And so that provision is now front and center of the hot button issues in front of the NPT, because the Middle East is now saying, okay, it's been 20 years, let's see, 25 years it will be in the next review conference next January, and no action. And so we want action, or there'll be consequences for the NPT. So along with the test ban, those are the two big threats to the treaty.
So the context was the treaty becomes almost universal. Every country in the world except for India, Pakistan, North Korea was in it and dropped out when they felt that they're under threat, and Israel. So the countries in the Middle East were saying that, Mary, hello.
Yeah, hi, thank you.
Hi.
This is fascinating.
Okay. So the countries in the Middle East were saying, look, we have a neighbor that's not in the treaty. Their nuclear facilities are not being investigated and safeguarded. We would like to have a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Now, most of the people in the world don't know, and of course you've written a book about this, that the majority of nations in the world are in nuclear weapons-free zones, in which they're both parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and they have regional agreements prohibiting the weapons. So there's a treaty, the Treaty of Tlatelolco making Latin America nuclear weapons free, the Treaty of Rarotonga making the South Pacific, the Treaty of Pelindaba making Africa, the Treaty of Bangkok, the Southeast Asia, the Treaty of Astana making Central Asia. And that's, so the countries in the Middle East have said, we expect delivery on this. We expect nuclear weapons to help us.
That principles document in the UN, there should be more, for the NPT extension, there should be more of these regional treaties in existence, in particular in the Middle East.
In the Middle East. So I was at the, last year at the UN, there was a meeting of the states parties in the region on their own to start try and make progress on that. And I would commend to anyone's attention your book on this subject, The Alternate Route, that fleshes out the need for strengthening these regimes. So it was really, I have a sense that gaining the extension of the treaty had a lot to do with the personal relationship you had with the diplomats of the non-aligned countries, South Africa, Egypt, as well as the Russians.
Oh, yeah.
The human element, the element of trusting one another. How does that play out?
Jonathan, as I've often said, diplomacy is really not that difficult. Some of the problems are very difficult, but being a negotiator, a diplomat is not that difficult. It's human relations 101. You just have to listen to the other side and compare it with what your country wants and try to work something out. And one story, I had that kind of relationship with the Russian ambassador, and you know, I have to read it before I can vote, sort of thing. But the story I have the most fun with is right before the conference, Washington Post ran a series of front page stories on the NPT Extension Conference, and six straight newspapers editions. And the last one, the day that the conference opened, it had a picture of me and the Mexican ambassador, Miguel Marin Bosch, who was a thorn in the side of the White House, but I thought he was a pretty great guy. But anyway, it set up the pictures of the two of us, so it looked like we were about to start a fist fight with each other. And then it said, you know, difficulty extension at the conference to come, or something like that. So I get to the General Assembly. I'm in New York this time. I get to the General Assembly where we had the opening session, and the various seats are filling up, and I noticed the Mexican delegation wasn't far away. And so I walked over there and I said, well, now, have any of you read the Post this morning? And the foreign minister winked at me and he said, oh yeah, we've all read it. And Miguel comes up and he says, hey Tom, let's start a fist fight here on the floor and we'll be first page tomorrow. And so it's that kind of relationship that if you can develop it with your opposite number, it gets you past so many difficult things. Just the kind of relationship you'd want to have with a friend, even though you've got to remember, they're not friends. They represent, well, they might be friends, but they represent interests that are not your own. And you may be in conflict from time to time, as I often was.
Well, that's as Ted Turner said, jaw is better than war.
Yeah.
And you know, and I practiced law for several decades, and you know, people are often found it strange that lawyers in adversarial situations could be very close friends as people, and oftentimes so much human suffering was prevented, in my experience, from the professional relationship that diplomats have. Right now, you know, so much of the work that you did, I mean, you were instrumental in getting the weapons from targeting Western Europe with negotiating the INF treaty. But I know that people are wanting to know that we've come now with the last few years with the United States degrading its commitment to international legal obligations. We've walked away from the INF treaty. But more importantly, we have an administration which is not trusted. There are things that the president says, people in the rest of the world, they don't really believe that he knows what he's talking about or cares what he's talking about. And now the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, again, part of the agreement that I know you made in '95 was every 5 years it would be reviewed to see progress on disarmament. It's going to be reviewed next year. And so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about where you think we are today and what we need to do to go forward. What needs to be done now? And what can the people listening do to help move the ball forward?
Well, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but it based on their record, at least thus far, it doesn't seem to me as though this administration is going to do anything to make the situation better. They've destroyed the Iran agreement, the INF agreement, the Open Skies agreement, and the only remaining sort of nuclear agreement of importance is the New START treaty, which they have, which expires in February, but there's a 5-year renewal attached to it, and they will not commit to renewing the treaty, and has been proposed by the other side, by Putin, and years ago, 2 years ago, and we've never responded on that. And the thing is that the NPT, as I said earlier, it's a bargain. I mean, it's a deal. It's not some gift. We don't have some special right to have nuclear weapons. And as John F. Kennedy said, nuclear weapons spreading widely in the world is the greatest possible danger and hazard. So you would think that whatever your basic orientation is, conservative or liberal or somewhere in between, you wouldn't want nuclear weapons spreading around the world so that, let's say, Venezuela has them. And they're easy to make. Simple ones are easy to make. Just take some highly enriched uranium and a titanium tube and some plastic explosives, and that was Hiroshima. And sophisticated weapons, it's a different story, but it's just so deeply contrary to the interest of the United States not to try to control nuclear weapons. And of course, they always say, well, we'll come up with a better treaty, but they never do. So I don't want to get politic here, but if there's either a complete change of heart of this administration or a new administration in January, I would hope they first would extend the New START treaty, and I would hope that they would make sure that the test ban treaty is ratified. We don't need that treaty in force. We've made more nuclear tests than all the rest of the world combined. We know more about nuclear weapons than any other country. It's only to our advantage to ratify that treaty. And the only purpose of nuclear weapons today is for countries that otherwise would, we could easily, tell what to do. Like say Ukraine, formerly used to be, or Iran, they want nuclear weapons so they can use them against us as levers to get advantages against us. It's not in our interest for lots of countries to have nuclear weapons, and so I would hope that ratification of that would be pursued, and then it's also not in our interest that large numbers of nuclear weapons continue to exist. I recognize it's very difficult to go to zero because that's requires verification and trust on a level that just doesn't exist in the world today. But it can safely go to very low levels, and that is another thing that should be pursued. And I mean, there's not targets in the world worth more than 300 weapons, and we have whatever it is, 4,500, and Russians have about 7,000 or 8,000, and so it's going to take a lot of negotiating. And I used to work a lot with Paul Nitze, the famous Cold Warrior and also a diplomat who believed in disarmament. And he told me once that when he approached a negotiation on nuclear weapons with another state or states, uh, he tried to imagine before the negotiations began what that narrow strip would be where the two countries or three countries could stand comfortably. And then once he figured out what he thought it was, he would try to steer US government policy in that direction. It's that kind of attitude that we have to have to negotiate some of these difficult problems. And at a minimum, for the next 4 or 5 years, we should try to ratify the test ban, do something about the Middle East. Something's got to be done, or there's going to be a conflict out there involving nuclear weapons, the Iranians and the Egyptians, because the Iranians probably know a way to get weapons without testing and without doing much more work from another country, which I will not name. It's not inconceivable they're good. So something needs to be done there, and hopefully we can try to get nuclear weapons down to a very low level to reduce the risk that they will be used, and fundamentally, Jonathan, more than nuclear weapons. I mean, the world is not in a good position. In addition to nuclear weapons, we've got climate change, which we can do as much damage as nuclear weapons can, just over a much longer period of time. And we've all got to cooperate together. What was the famous phrase between John Hancock and Ben Franklin? We either hang together or hang separately. That's where we are today in the world. We're either going to work together or we're not going to survive very happily.
I didn't expect this, but we have a lot of people wanting to interact and pose some questions here, Tom.
Sure.
We had planned on only going for an hour. So I'm going to just close, we'll continue and take the questions, but I'm going to just close this now. So we'll have an hour of a show for people, because I think this is really important. And I just want to close highlighting the last point that you made, and then we'll bring the other people in, which is that we are faced with changing the climate of the planet. Well, that's sort of an abstraction, but to me, it means it will change the temperature of the oceans. If we change the temperature of the oceans, we're going to change the biological balance in the oceans, possibly the pH acidic balance of the oceans. We know that 50 to 70% of our oxygen comes from phytoplankton. We don't know what will happen if we change the fundamental temperature of the oceans. And this is not something we should be experimenting with. This is actually part of our very breathing. Half of our breathing comes from the health of this organism that lives in the oceans. We have no idea what effect dramatically changing the climate will have on pandemic diseases which don't carry passports. We have no idea what will happen when you change the temperature around the equator. And we know that there'll be tremendous social disruptions, but we don't even know whether the biosystem of the planet will support civilization. And it seems to me that it behooves us to be cooperating and have a different definition of security, in which human security and cooperation are the norm. And it's people like yourself that have proven that even during the Cold War, even in the worst of circumstances, that thin place where common ground can be found is obtainable if people operate in goodwill. And that to me is what we're lacking, is really sincere goodwill amongst the leaders of the world to work together in a mature way.
Jonathan, I agree with everything you said, except I'd make just one slight modification. We need people of goodwill or at least people that clearly understand what their real interests are. It's the same.
On that, we thank everybody for joining this first of GSI's Conversations That Matter, and for the extra added, I want to recognize. I'm asking the one of our technical people to let Doug Roach pop in. He's had his hand up, and Senator Doug Roach was a Canadian ambassador and a senator from Alberta, creator of the Middle Powers Initiative. He was one of the leaders of Parliamentarians for Global Action. He is amongst the world's leading experts and advocates on the subject of nuclear weapons. Senator Roach, if you would.
Jonathan, is the program still going on?
Still going on.
We're still going on, okay.
So could...
Thank you, Jonathan, and I send my warm greetings to my old colleague, Ambassador Graham. I'd like to ask Ambassador Graham the following question. In the campaign platform of Joe Biden, the commitments by Vice President Biden, if he becomes president, to returning the United States into the Iran agreement. Also a commitment to advance a shared objective to denuclearize North Korea, and a commitment to extend the New START treaty, which Tom referred to a few moments ago. There's also a very interesting commitment that he would restate the purpose of the US holding nuclear weapons, namely that it would be only for the sole purpose of the deterrence, which of course would be quite a significant change from the present. Now, I want to ask Ambassador Graham, in the event of Joe Biden president, and with the commitments to arms control and disarmament that I have referred to that he's made, does Ambassador Graham think that if these came about, this would then open the door to the two particular points that he called for a few moments ago, namely US ratification of the CTBT and the creation of a nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East? So would a Biden presidency restart or reinvigorate the nuclear disarmament architecture sufficiently that we could then begin to make the kind of progress that the NPT foretold in Article 6?
Well, Doug, great to see you, by the way. The answer to your first question is no. It wouldn't change anything. The answer to your second question about creating new architecture, maybe so, but Israel has to change, and Iran has to change. For it to, both those countries have to make changes if we're to have any kind of reasonable peace there, and I don't think that Iran is likely to rejoin the nuclear agreement. I think it's finished. I think that if it is President Biden, I think President Biden might be able to offer things that would be attractive enough for Iran to rejoin, but Saudi Arabia and Israel would go crazy if he did. So I both of them want that agreement gone, and they both see Iran as an existential threat to them, or close to an existential threat. And so I I think it's going to take a different kind of diplomacy to deal with that. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it has to involve Saudi, Israel, and Iran and the U.S. at the same table. It's got to involve that, and then maybe something can be worked out that will make everybody comfortable. And it's not going to be easy to get to. It may be impossible. I don't know, but if Biden is elected, I think there's going to be fireworks set off in so many countries that maybe there'll be enough emotional goodwill that something as radical as that might be possible. And that's what I would call a new architecture.
We have a group of interns here at the Global Security Institute, where actually Senator Roach is on our board of advisors, and of course Tom is on the board of directors. So I wanted to open it up to Vittorio. I see you had your hand up, and maybe you would identify yourself, because you guys are from all over the world and you're the future for us.
Could you sign me up, please? This is Mahmoud Karim from Cairo, Egypt.
Oh, please, Ambassador, go right ahead, and we have time.
I'll wait for Victoria, and then I can speak after her.
Okay, thank you, that's very kind.
I didn't hear who this is.
Well, it's Vittorio, and then Ambassador Karam from Egypt, I think. Vittorio?
Hello, my name is Vittorio. I'm an intern for the GSI, and I'm from Italy. Thank you so much to begin with for the very insightful and informative talk. So my question would be, as of today, what are the main challenges facing progress towards the goal of a WMD free zone in the Middle East?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? It didn't come through very clearly.
Yeah, my question would be, what are the main challenges facing progress towards the goal of a WMD free zone in the Middle East?
Yes. Well, obviously, the principal problem is the suspicion of Israel that Iran is a state they can't live with, and there has to be a fundamental change in Iran for them to be able to live with Iran, because Iran has the objective of acquiring nuclear weapons. They have footholds in Syria where they could put short-range missiles which could obliterate Israel in just a few minutes. But ultimately, Israel is trying to build a modern technological state, and that requires people to stay there. And a lot of if this continues to heat up there will be many families involving highly talented scientists who'll say, we need to go live somewhere else. That's what Israel's most afraid of with Iran, that they'll create an atmosphere that will not be comfortable for the kind of people to come to build up their technological capability that they hope to have. So there has to be, as I said before, a big change in Israel and a big change in Iran to permit progress. But maybe it can happen. I mean, you know, I was always told the Soviet Union was going to last forever. That's what people always told me. So you never know. What is it? James Bond said, "Never say never," and so that's the number one problem. Saudi, I think Saudi would probably support, if not for Iran, would probably support a free zone, or maybe even with Iran. I don't know. They certainly didn't like the agreement much. Very few of the Arab states did. But if there's an attempt to de-weaponize the Middle East, maybe they'll support that. It's possible.
Well, we certainly have one of the experts. Ambassador Karim, were you one of the co-authors with Ambassador Shakur, Mohammed Shakur?
Shakur, yes.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Well, I didn't realize that we had you on the call because I know the work that you've done. I mean, you and Ambassador Shakur are, you're up there in the handful of people who you wrote the definitive book on the history of the NPT, the definitive book of record of the treaty. So your opinion on these matters carries great weight with us. And please, we'd like to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Christian. It's a pleasure really to see you, and of course to see my good friend Thomas Graham. I'm so happy to see him looking so well and fighting and still remembering all the nitty-gritties of what transpired in 1995. I also want to say hello to everyone on this panel. This is very instructive. I will not be able to stay until the very end, but I just wanted to say a few words on the package that happened in 1995, because I was there working with Thomas Graham on the Middle East resolution, and it was not difficult. It was not.
I spent a lot of time with Egypt.
Absolutely, and it was not easy even to formulate, because you mentioned that the Russians did not have the text, and you gave it to them. But the point is that this was a very carefully and difficultly negotiated text, not only with the United States, but even within the Arab group itself. Put yourself in our place when we had to go back to the Arab group and tell them, if you want to name call Israel in the resolution you want to mention, then we will have to mention 3 other Arab countries that have not yet joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And they are the United Arab Emirates, Djibouti, and Oman. And you can imagine what we received, what we heard from the representatives of these 3 countries, and they completely said, no, we will never accept to name call. How can you equate us with Israel? What nuclear capabilities do we have as non-nuclear weapon states with Israel in this regard? But anyhow, the point I'm trying to make is that it was the full engagement of the United States that we appreciated very much, which made this resolution possible. And it was a resolution that was part of a package that made the extension treaty possible. And I underline that. If it were not for the resolution on the Middle East, there would have not been an indefinite extension of the treaty, not only because of the Arab position, not only because of Egypt's position, but because of the NAM position, a group of non-aligned countries that was supporting the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, which incidentally is a resolution that dates back to 1974 and had and remains to be accepted by the General Assembly every year, including Israel, by consensus. And consensus happened after Sadat left to Jerusalem. And it came against, I was the one who negotiated the text of this resolution with Ambassador Ilan from Israel at the time in the sides of the first committee. And it, again, the Egyptians were sitting with the Israelis. The Egyptians were reaching out to the United States. And the United States was playing an extremely important role. So again, I wrote a question to you, Thomas, on why we need US leadership in this conference that convened last November and will convene again next year. And we hope very much that the leadership of the United States will continue in this regard. You cannot continue to boycott this conference that has and supports a very important initiative, which you have supported from the very start, even from 1974 until today. So again, let me end here, thanking you very much. I am so happy to see you, Tom, and I wish you the best of health, and I hope we can continue this kind of chat as we go. And again, thank you, Christian, for amassing all these distinguished people in this panel. It's almost 11 o'clock in Cairo now, so I should have been in bed an hour ago.
Oh, well, thank you so much for those comments, I appreciate so much all that you've written about the NPT. I've personally learned so much from reading reading your work on the NPT. I have a copy at home, and I mean, right, not right here, but nearby, and the United States supports the resolution. After all, we were a co-sponsor, and we were co-sponsors when nobody else would be co-sponsors. I think that I very much hope. I hope that the next administration, whoever's in charge next year, of course, I have my own biases, but just who's ever in charge of foreign policy of this country, I hope that they do their best to bring that resolution to a successful conclusion. I mean, we had a negotiation for a while in Acres, and I've participated in these sort of 1.5 negotiations, so Ambassador, it's just so great to see you, and appreciate your coming to this. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum, Ambassador. We'll move on to Natalie. You wanted to pose something, so we have Natalie and Robert, and then John Burroughs.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm an intern at GSI and I'm from London in the UK. I just want to thank you, Ambassador Graham, for giving this talk. It's been really incredibly insightful. I wanted to draw on the particular emphasis you put on the human and environmental impacts of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I wanted to ask of your opinion on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and whether you see its enforcement as something obtainable in the near future, or whether you think it contradicts and could hinder other nuclear arms treaties and agreements.
So, Jonathan, you want me to answer that question, or do you want to answer it?
No, no, you're definitely the star here.
Well, I mean, that you won't like my answer.
That doesn't matter.
I'm afraid. What was the speaker's name?
Natalie.
Natalie?
Yeah.
So Natalie, let she come back on the screen. Anyway, Natalie, I don't think that the so-called ban treaty is a step forward because it doesn't include anyone who hasn't already agreed not to have nuclear weapons, and it causes the weapon states to think that they're being poorly treated. I guess that's one way of saying it. In any case, it's an idea that's been around for a long time in different forms. The Indians in the 1990s used to call it time-bound disarmament. The United States has always fought against it with every bit of energy that we had, as have the other weapon states. They're never going to agree with that, and until they're never going to agree to anything on further reductions, deep reductions on nuclear weapons. It's not accompanied by an intrusive, worldwide, very complicated inspection arrangement. And anything that suggests that we would agree, that the weapon states would agree to anything to the contrary, is just going to be disappointed. but I appreciate your answer. You asking the question, and I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer, but that's what I believe.
Robert?
Hi, my name is Robert. I'm an intern at GSI and I live in New Jersey. Thank you, Ambassador Graham, for your time today and your insight. And thank you, Mr. Granoff, for hosting this session. So my question's rather broad, but I was hoping you could answer, Ambassador Graham. How do you facilitate a global rise in nationalism and a yearning for isolationism through diplomacy today? Does it impede cooperation vis-a-vis states, or does it prompt a different type of diplomatic effort? And specifically when it comes to nuclear disarmament and arms control.
You're talking about nationalism.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think that nationalism as it's being practiced today is not consistent with the kind of state practice that has to be adopted by major states if we're going to have a chance to advance disarmament, and if we're going to have a chance to mitigate climate change. It's a ticket for self-destruction, and states are misguided in the extreme if they follow it. It reminds me of the 1930s and the way states behaved then, right before the Second World War, and we know what that was like. Only this time, the price for pursuing these kind of self-serving you call it, people call it nationalist, but it's more than that. It's just an obsession with self that is detrimental to relations with other countries, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work as a policy, and it usually leads to very difficult times, as it already has.
Pretty clear. You know, it's the distinction between patriotism, especially as an American, where the ought was put forward by Thomas Jefferson. The ought.
That's different.
Well, we put forward an ought to the world that all humans are created equal. When he said it, certainly women were not part of that ought, neither were people of color, and neither were people without property. But that ought has been a principle of legitimacy for governance ever since. And it seems to me that the nationalist movement in the United States has forgotten the very foundational principles upon which the United States is founded. And in a time in which we're confronted with a virus that doesn't carry a passport, the idea of retreating into tribalism rather than cooperating in advancing global public health and well-being is not myopic, it's insane. And so I agree very strongly with Ambassador Graham that we've got to grow up and deal with the fact that the planet Earth is unified, the climate is unified, and nuclear weapons, as General E. Butler, who used to be head of the nuclear arsenal of the United States when he was in the military, said it codifies the worst of our human capacities. It codifies a principle that if all dialogue fails, we would annihilate ourselves. And that's in the interest of what? In the interest of the state, we would annihilate the planet. So
now, I do recognize that there is a liberal international point of view and a conservative practical point of view, and I want to take the liberty of reading a few lines that represent what I would call the conservative practical view, but still not nationalism. It goes, America has uniformly spoken among nations, though often too heedless and often to disdainful ears, the language of equal liberty, of equal justice and of equal right. She has, in the lapse of nearly half a century, without a single exception, respected the independence of other nations while asserting and maintaining her own. She has abstained from interference in the concern of others, even when the conflict has been for principles to which she clings. Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been, or shall be unfurled, there will her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be, but she goes not abroad in search of monsters to be destroyed. Now that was stated by the Secretary of State on July 4th, 1820, I believe, by John Quincy Adams. And that's I mean, it's possible to be independent and to be happy with your independence, but still recognize the rights of others to be what they want to be, as long as they don't upset the international order.
Dr. Burrows?
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm John Burrows, Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy. We share an office with Jonathan Granoff in Global Security Institute and Christian Chibano, who helped.
John.
Yeah, hello, John. Good. Hello, Ambassador Graham. It's good to see you. So I read your book about nuclear weapon-free zones, a rather major piece of work, and I recommend it to everybody. I have a quite specific question. Assuming that Joe Biden is elected, the inauguration would take place on January 20th. That would be 2/3 of the way into the NPT review conference if it takes place in January. It's tentatively scheduled to take place in January. We'll see if it does, but let's say it does. Could the new administration come in on January 21st and have a new approach to the review conference and help achieve an agreed substantive outcome? Or is that too little time to turn things around?
When is the conference scheduled to start? The 15th?
It starts early January and ends late January. So January 20th would be about 2/3 of the way through the conference.
I think that's far too late to change anything. I don't know whether if the Vice President Biden is elected president, I don't know if the outgoing administration will cooperate with him or not. If they did, and there wasn't any sort of fundamental issues between the two, maybe there'd be a way to carry on. But I suspect there will be over the nuclear weapon-free zone for the Middle East, and maybe I don't know. Maybe, well, test ban just probably won't come up, and they'll try to keep it from coming up, and it probably won't. It hasn't the last two review conferences, and the emphasis has been on the Middle East situation, and my guess is by the time the Biden delegation arrives, if there hasn't been cooperation, well, I don't know. I'm just trying to imagine what it might be like. I could imagine a situation where a final document is being advanced, which includes the establishment of a conference on the Middle East to be chaired, like at the last one, to be chaired by the Secretary General and convened in 190 days to address the subject of weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. And by the 21st of January, that draft final document would probably be circulating, and countries would be deciding whether to support it or not. And of course, it doesn't get adopted if it's not supported by everyone. And at the last time, the British, the Canadians, and the US withheld their agreement and defeated the final document. I'm sure the British and the Canadians would be happy to back off if the US did so at the end. So maybe it might be possible to get such a document through, knowing that there is going to be a change in delegations and possibly a change in policy. So I guess I shouldn't be so firm that it's too late. It might not be too late for that.
Thank you. Well, we're going to conclude this now. I want to just highlight, I was looking at some of the participants in this call. We have Tariq Raouf, who has written extensively on this subject, and I commend to everyone's attention his writings suggesting postponing the NPT so that there is adequate time. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. I also want to highlight another person I noticed here is Hans Karel, who's one of my heroes. He was the
Mine too.
He was one of the leading advocates of strengthening international law and justice, and using the principle of the rule of law, or the power of law, rather than, as John Burroughs has said, the law of power, to advance human qualities. My concern is very simple. Science and technology is like a horse that's run out of the barn, and the two reins for the horse that we need are law and morality. And nuclear weapons are the example of whether we're going to control that, the horse of science and technology, with the tools of law and morality. And it's really been an honor to have Ambassador Graham, who has so deftly used those tools to make the world a safer and better place. And Tom, I want to say publicly, you've been an inspiration for me and many others. And for that, I publicly want to say thank you so very, very much.
My pleasure, Jonathan. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. We'll terminate the Zoom world and stay together in our spirits.
Okay. Good luck, everybody.